Some stories find us when we least expect them. This one came to me like a whisper carried on prairie wind, a tale of two broken souls who stumbled into each other's lives when both had given up on belonging anywhere. It speaks of wolves and wilderness, of choices made in split seconds that change everything. But more than that, it speaks of what happens when someone decides to stay. I share it now because I believe we all need reminding. No heart is too wounded to love again, and no road is too long to lead us home. The scream cut through Redstone Valley like a blade through wet cloth. Clay West yanked the reins. His horse skidded, dust rising in amber clouds. 3 weeks alone on this cattle drive. 3 weeks of nothing but wind and his own breathing. Now this. He saw her before his mind caught up with his eyes. A woman, young, pressed against a boulder near the dead cottonwood, her calico dress torn at the shoulder. She held a broken branch in both hands, knuckles white, swinging it at the shadows circling her. 5 wolves, gray and patient. The led one crouched low, haunches coiled. Clay's hand found his colt before thought gave permission. The cattle behind him scattered. He didn't look back. The woman's eyes met his across 40 yards of sagebrush and dying light. She stopped screaming. If you have a moment, I would be grateful to know where you are reading from today. My grandmother used to say the best stories travel farthest when shared by kind souls, and I reckon she was right about most things. Clay fired into the sky. The cracks split the air, sharp as breaking bone. The wolves turned. All 5 heads swiveled toward him, away from the woman. Good. That was what he wanted. "Run!" he shouted. His voice came out raw, scraped from somewhere deep in his chest. "Get behind the rocks and don't stop." He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. His horse lurched forward, and Clay fired again once, twice, the percussion cap snapping, smoke curling from the barrel. The cattle behind him bellowed and scattered. 12 animals worth 3 months' wages disappearing into the sagebrush in 4 different directions. He let them go. The lead wolf changed course. It moved low and fast, gray fur rippling, closing the distance between them. Clay's horse reared, the saddle tilted. His boots lost the stirrups. He hit the ground hard, air punched out of his lungs. The colt flew from his grip, skittering across packed earth. He rolled, tasting dust and copper, and something hot and sharp raked across his left side, claws catching fabric and flesh before the animal twisted away. Another gunshot. His own gun. Somehow back in his hand, finger squeezing without thought. The wolves scattered. Silence crashed down. Clay lay on his back, staring at a sky turning purple at the edges. His side burned. Wet heat spread beneath his shirt. The smell of blood mixed with gunpowder and sage. Footsteps, light and quick. A shadow fell across his face. The woman knelt beside him. Her hands hovered over his chest, trembling, unsure where to land. Dirt streaked her cheeks. A scratch ran along her jaw, thin and red. Her breath came in short, ragged pulls. Clay's mouth moved. The words scraped out before he could stop them. "You hurt." She stared at him. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Her eyes gray. He noticed now. Gray like storm clouds searched his face. "You're bleeding," she whispered. He tried to sit up. Pain lanced through his ribs, white and blinding. He fell back. The sky spun. "The wolves," he managed. "They gone?" She nodded. Her hand pressed against his side, warm through the torn fabric. Blood seeped between her fingers. "Can you walk?" she asked. Clay looked at her face, the fear there, and something else beneath it, something harder. He had no idea who this woman was, or why she'd been alone in wolf country with nothing but a stick. But right now, she was the only thing standing between him and dying in the dirt. The cabin sat at the edge of Elk Creek, half hidden by cottonwoods gone yellow with autumn. Grace had found it 2 days ago, door hanging loose on rusted hinges, windows still intact. A place to hide after they left her on the road with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now she needed to get a bleeding stranger inside. Clay's horse stood where it had wandered after throwing him, reins trailing in the dirt. Grace approached slowly, hands open, voice low. "Easy now." Easy. The animal snorted, but didn't bolt. She grabbed the reins and led it back to where Clay lay, his face pale beneath the stubble and trail dust. I can't carry you, she said, but I can drag you. Can you hold on? Clay's eyes opened, glassy, unfocused. He nodded once. Grace pulled the saddle blanket free and spread it on the ground beside him. Getting him onto it took everything she had, her arms shaking, her breath coming in gasps, his weight dead and heavy as she rolled him onto the wool. She tied the blanket's corners to the saddle horn with strips torn from her petticoat. Walk, she told the horse. Slow. The animal moved. The blanket dragged across the packed earth, and Clay groaned with each bump and stone. Grace walked beside him, one hand on the horse's neck, the other pressing her bundled shawl against his bleeding side. The cabin was 300 yards away. It felt like 3 miles. By the time she kicked the door open, the light had gone from purple to black. Stars pricked the sky. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote called. She lit the coal oil lamp with matches she'd found in a drawer 2 days ago. The flame caught, and orange light spilled across the single room, a cast iron stove in the corner, a narrow bed with an iron frame, shelves stocked with flour and salt, and dried beans left by whoever had lived here before. Getting Clay from the blanket to the bed took the last of her strength. She half lifted, half rolled him onto the corn husk mattress, and his body went slack, a groan escaping through clenched teeth. Stay awake, she said. I need you to stay awake. His eyes opened. He looked at her like he was seeing someone else. She crossed to the shelf where she'd stored her few salvaged things, a canteen, a sewing kit from the cabin's drawer, a chunk of lye soap. Her hands shook as she poured water onto a strip of cloth. The wound was worse than she'd thought. 3 deep gouges ran along his left side, just below the ribs. The flesh had torn in ragged lines. Blood welled up, dark and steady. She cleaned it as best she could, wiping away dirt and dried blood. Clay's hands gripped the edge of the mattress. The corn husks crackled beneath him. His breath hissed between his teeth, but he didn't cry out. What's your name? She asked. She needed him talking, needed him conscious. Clay. The word came out cracked. Clay West. I'm Grace. He didn't ask for her last name. She didn't offer it. She threaded the needle with horsehair black and coarse, the only thing strong enough for this kind of work. Her fingers trembled. She held them in front of her face, watching them shake, willing them to stop. This is going to hurt, she whispered. Clay's eyes met hers. Clear now. Present. I know. She pushed the needle through skin. His whole body went rigid. A sound escaped him, not a scream, but something lower, pressed down deep in his throat. His knuckles went white on the mattress frame. She pulled the thread through, tied it off, pushed the needle in again, stitch after stitch. She counted without meaning to. 7, 8, 9. Sweat ran down her temples. Her back ached from hunching over him. The lamp flickered each time a draft slipped through the gaps in the walls. 12 stitches, 13. Clay's breathing had gone shallow. His eyes were closed now, his face pale beneath the stubble. She tied off the last stitch and sat back. Her hands were covered in his blood. It had dried in the creases of her palms, brown and cracking. The cabin was quiet. Outside, the coyote called again. The sound echoed and faded. Grace looked at the man on the bed, this stranger who had ridden toward wolves instead of away from them, who had taken claws meant for her. Why did you stop? She asked. The question hung in the air. She didn't expect an answer. Clay's chest rose and fell. His fingers had loosened their grip on the mattress. Sleep had taken him, or something close to it. She pulled the faded quilt up over his chest wedding ring pattern. The colors washed out to ghosts of blue and cream. Someone had made this quilt with care. Once, someone who lived here before the cabin went empty. Grace lowered herself into the chair by the window. Her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. She could feel exhaustion pulling at her bones. She'd been running for 3 days. No food since yesterday morning. No water until she found the creek. And now this. A man bleeding in a stranger's bed. A cabin that wasn't hers. Wolves that might come back. She reached for the rifle he'd dropped in the valley, now propped against the wall by the door. She'd never fired one before. Clay woke to the smell of coffee. It reached him before anything else bitter and dark, curling through the cabin like smoke. His eyes opened. Morning light filtered through muslin curtains gone yellow with age, falling in pale stripes across the wooden floor. He tried to sit up. Pain flared along his left side, sharp and immediate. His arms shook. He managed 2 inches before falling back against the pillow, chest heaving, sweat breaking across his forehead. The woman appeared beside the bed. Grace. Her name surfaced through the fog. "Easy," she said. "Don't tear the stitches." She slid one arm behind his shoulders. Her grip was stronger than he expected. Together, they got him upright, his back against the iron headboard, the cornhusk mattress rustling beneath him. The cabin came into focus. Small, 1 room, a cast-iron stove in the corner where a dented tin pot sat steaming. Shelves lined with flour sacks, salt boxes, dried beans in glass jars, supplies left by whoever had lived here before. A cracked mirror hung on the wall beside a wash basin with chipped enamel. Grace crossed to the stove. Her dress was the same one from yesterday calico, torn at the shoulder, stained brown along the hem. His blood. She moved quietly, lifting the pot, pouring dark liquid into a tin cup. In the daylight, he could see her properly for the first time, younger than he'd thought, mid-20s, maybe. Brown hair pulled back, loose strands falling around a face gone thin, gray eyes that watched him without blinking. She brought the cup to him. Steam rose from the surface. "Found coffee in the cabin stores," she said. "And biscuits, day old, but they'll fill you." Clay reached for the cup. His hand trembled. The tin felt too heavy. Grace's fingers brushed his as she helped steady the grip. Neither of them spoke. The touch lasted half a second, maybe less. But something passed through it, a current of awareness. 2 strangers sharing space that suddenly felt smaller. Clay lifted the cup to his lips. The coffee was strong, bitter, nothing to cut the taste. It burned, going down. He welcomed it. Grace returned with a plate, 2 biscuits and a strip of salt pork, the meat dried and curling at the edges. Clay ate without tasting. His body demanded fuel. His hands still shook with each bite. "This your place?" His voice came out hoarse, scraped raw. Grace shook her head. "Found it 2 days ago. Empty. Door was open. You've been out here alone since then." She didn't answer right away. She sat in the chair by the window, hands folded in her lap, fingers laced tight. She looked at the light coming through, at the dust motes floating in the beams, at anything but him. "I was with a group," she said finally, "heading to a ranch auction down in Morrison. There was a man organizing transport, said he needed workers. Household help, he called it." Clay set down the biscuit. His hand had stopped moving. "I didn't have money for my share of supplies. They let me come anyway. Said I could work it off when we arrived." Her voice stayed flat, reciting facts. 3 days on the road, I started hearing things. What kind of work they really meant. What happened to the other girls who couldn't pay. The muscle in Clay's jaw tightened. He said nothing. "So I ran." Grace turned her head, meeting his eyes. "Middle of the night? Just walked off into the dark. They didn't follow. Reckon they figured the wolves would do their work for them." She said it without self-pity, without anger, just the way things were. Clay looked at this woman half-starved, wearing a torn dress, sitting in an abandoned cabin with a man she'd pulled bleeding from the dirt. She'd stitched his wounds with horsehair and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She'd sat up through the night watching for wolves, holding a rifle she didn't know how to fire, and she was telling him her shame like it was nothing, like she owed him the truth just because he'd asked. He picked up the coffee cup again, drained it. The tin made a small sound against his teeth. "That auction," he said. His voice was quiet. "The man running it, he got a name." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly, measuring him. "Garrett," she said. "Bill Garrett. scar across his left cheek, walked with a limp. Clay filed the name away, somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he didn't visit often. A door opened. Why do you want to know? He set the cup on the small table beside the bed. His hands had curled into fists against the quilt. No reason, but his knuckles had gone white, and Grace watched them tighten, watched his whole body change shape around something she couldn't see. Outside, a horse whinnied. Both their heads turned toward the window. Clay's horse stood where Grace had tied him, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring, staring at something in the tree line. The animal pawed at the ground, once, twice, then went still. It was a deer, a young buck, stepping out from the cottonwoods to drink at the creek. Clay watched it through the window until his heartbeat slowed, until his hands unclenched from the blanket. 3 days passed. The rhythm came without planning. Grace rose before dawn to start the fire in the cast-iron stove. Clay woke to the sound of kindling catching, the snap and pop of dry wood giving itself over to flame. She brought him coffee first, then food, whatever she could find in the cabin's stores or forage from the land around it. His wound closed slowly. The stitches held. Each morning, Grace peeled back the bandage and checked for infection, her fingers careful against the angry red lines. Each morning, she found the flesh knitting together, the swelling going down. On the second day, Clay sat up on his own. On the third, he stood. His legs shook beneath him. He gripped the iron bed frame until the trembling passed, then walked 3 steps to the chair by the window. It took everything he had. He sat there for an hour, breathing hard, watching the creek catch sunlight. Grace didn't hover. She moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, sweeping the floor, checking the water in the pump, mending a hole in the muslin curtain with thread she'd pulled from the hem of her petticoat. She worked without speaking, and Clay found himself grateful for the silence. In the evenings, she read aloud. The Bible had been tucked in a drawer beneath the bed, its leather cover cracked and peeling, its pages yellow with age. Someone had pressed wildflowers between the pages, columbine and Indian paintbrush. Their colors faded to whispers of pink and blue. Grace opened to Psalms and began to read. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Her voice was low and even, not preaching, just reading. The words filled the cabin like smoke from the lamp, drifting into corners, settling into the silence. Clay listened without comment. The verses stirred something in him, memories of a wooden church in Kansas, his mother's hand on his shoulder, the smell of candle wax and Sunday clothes. A lifetime ago. Before the fire, before everything. He didn't ask her to stop. On the third evening, Grace set down the Bible and looked at him across the small space between bed and chair. Your cattle, she said. They scattered in the valley. You going to look for them? Clay had been thinking about those cattle for 3 days. 12 head, 3 months of work, driving them up from Texas. His whole stake in the world, gone in the time it took to fire 3 shots. Maybe, he said. He didn't move toward the door. Grace watched him for a long moment, then nodded once and picked up the Bible again. She didn't ask why he stayed. The next morning, Clay found a knife in the cabin's single-drawer bone handle, blade gone dull. The wood cracked where it met the steel. He asked Grace for something to work with. She brought him a piece of cottonwood branch, dense and pale. He sat in the chair by the window and began to carve. The work was slow. His hands remembered the motions from years past, but his left side screamed each time he pressed too hard. He carved in small strokes, shaving away curls of wood that fell to the floor like pale ribbons. Grace watched him from across the room, where she sat with his torn shirt spread across her lap. A thimble gleamed on her finger, tarnished brass. Too big for her, probably left by whoever lived here before. She pushed the needle through fabric, pulled the thread tight, pushed again. You don't have to do that, Clay said. She didn't look up. I know. The needle kept moving, in and out, steady as breathing. Clay turned back to his carving. The handle was taking shape, now smooth where his palm would grip it, rough where his fingers would wrap around. He tested the weight. The balance, not bad, not good yet, but getting there, outside. Crickets began their evening chorus. The sound rose and fell, rhythmic, layered, filling the spaces between heartbeats. "Where'd you learn to sew like that?" Clay asked. Grace's hands paused, just for a moment. Then they started again. "My mother taught me, before she passed." "How long ago?" "4 years. My father went 6 months after. Fever took them both." Clay set down the knife. The wood shavings rustled at his feet. "I'm sorry." Grace looked up then. Her gray eyes held his across the lamplight. "You lose anyone?" The question landed in his chest like a stone dropped in still water. Ripples spread outward, touching things he'd buried deep. "A brother," he said. The words came out rough. "Long time ago." She waited. The needle hovered above the fabric, motionless. Clay picked up the knife again, started carving. "There's nothing else to tell," he said. Grace watched him for another moment. Then she bent her head and went back to her stitching. The fire crackled in the stove. The crickets sang. The lamp flickered as the kerosene ran low. Neither of them spoke again until the shirt was mended and the knife handle was done. Grace held up his shirt, inspecting her work. The tear was invisible now, the stitches small and tight. "It'll hold," she said. Clay held up the knife handle. The wood gleamed pale in the dying light. "So will this." She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. He handed her the handle. Their fingers touched again, longer this time, neither pulling away. Then hoofbeats sounded on the road outside, and both their heads turned toward the door. The hoofbeats belonged to a wagon, not riders. Clay watched through the window as a buckboard pulled up outside the cabin, driven by a woman in a gray wool dress and a bonnet that shadowed her face. Grace was already at the door. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said. Her voice carried a note Clay hadn't heard before, cautious, guarded. "What brings you out this way?" The woman climbed down from the wagon with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for decades. She was 60 if she was a day, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a mouth set in a thin line. She carried a basket over one arm, covered with a checkered cloth. "Brought you some things," Mrs. Pruitt said. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked past Grace into the cabin, her boots loud on the wooden floor. Her eyes found Clay immediately. He stood by the window, one hand braced against the frame for balance. His shirt was buttoned wrong. Grace's mending had saved it, but he dressed in haste when he heard the wagon. His hair was uncombed, his jaw dark with a week's worth of stubble. Mrs. Pruitt looked at him the way a person looks at a stain on a tablecloth. "And who might this be?" "A traveler," Grace said quickly. "He was injured on the road. I've been tending to his wounds." "I can see that." Mrs. Pruitt set the basket on the table. She didn't take her eyes off Clay. "What kind of injuries?" "Wolf attack," Clay said. His voice came out flat. "In Redstone Valley, 5 days ago." "Wolf attack." Mrs. Pruitt repeated the words like she was tasting them. "And you've been here ever since, in this cabin with Miss Holloway." The name hung in the air. Miss Holloway. As if the word miss carried its own accusation. Grace's chin lifted. "He couldn't travel. The wound was deep." "I'm sure it was." Mrs. Pruitt pulled back the cloth on the basket, revealing a loaf of bread, a small jar of preserves, and a wrapped bundle that smelled of smoked meat. Charity, offered with teeth. She turned to Clay. "You have people expecting you somewhere, Mr. West, Clay West." He met her gaze without blinking. "And no, ma'am, nobody's expecting me anywhere." Mrs. Pruitt's lips pressed thinner. She looked at Grace, then back at Clay, then at the single bed against the wall, the rumpled quilt, the pillow still dented from his head. "I see," she said. She stayed another 10 minutes, asked questions about the weather, the creek, the condition of the road. Her eyes kept drifting to the bed, to Clay's bare feet, to the way Grace stood too close to him and too far from the door. when she finally left. The silence she left behind felt heavier than her presence. Grace watched the wagon disappear down the road. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles white. "She'll talk," she said quietly. "By tomorrow, everyone in Elk Creek will know." Clay said nothing. There was nothing to say. The next morning, Grace put on her shawl and picked up the wicker basket Mrs. Pruitt had brought. "I need flour," she said. "Salt, a few other things. There's a general store in town." Clay pushed himself up from the chair. His side protested, but the pain was duller now, manageable. "I'll come with you." "No," Grace shook her head. "You can barely walk 100 yards. And besides," she stopped. Her jaw tightened. "It's better if I go alone. Less to explain." She was out the door before he could argue. Elk Creek was a mile and a half down the road. Grace walked it with the empty basket swinging at her side. Her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. The church steeple appeared first, rising above the tree line like a white finger pointing at heaven. Then the buildings, a dozen of them, maybe more, clustered along a single dirt street. She felt the eyes before she saw them. A woman sweeping her porch stopped and stared. Two men outside the blacksmith shop fell silent as she passed. A child pointed, and his mother pulled him back, whispering something Grace couldn't hear, but understood perfectly. The general store sat at the center of town. A painted sign above the door read, "Haskins Dry Goods," in letters that had once been red and were now faded to rust. Grace pushed through the door, and a bell jangled overhead. The store smelled of pickle brine and tobacco. Barrels lined the walls. Flour, sugar, beans, salt pork. Bolts of fabric were stacked on a table near the window. Calico and gingham and plain brown muslin. A woman stood behind the counter. Mrs. Haskins, gray hair pulled back tight. Spectacles perched on a nose that had been broken once and healed crooked. She looked at Grace the way Mrs. Pruitt had looked at Clay. "Morning," Grace said. She set the basket on the counter. "I need 2 pounds of flour and a half pound of salt, please." Mrs. Haskins didn't move. "Also some coffee, if you have it, and thread, white. If you have white." Still nothing. The woman's hands stayed flat on the counter, her eyes flat and cold. Grace felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Did you hear me? I said I need—" "I heard you." Mrs. Haskins' voice was ice. "We don't serve your kind here." The words landed like a slap. Grace stood very still. Behind her, she heard the door open. Another customer. Footsteps stopping short. "My kind," Grace repeated. "Women who live in sin with strange men. Women who take up residence in decent folks' abandoned homes without so much as a by your leave. Women who—" "That's enough." Grace's voice cut through the tirade. Quiet, but sharp. "You don't know anything about me. I know what Mrs. Pruitt told me this morning. I know what the whole town is saying. And I know I won't have my store tainted by association with thought." Grace picked up her basket. Her hands were steady. Her face was carved from stone. She walked out without another word. The door slammed behind her. The bell jangled, mocking. She walked the mile and a half back to the cabin with the basket empty and her spine straight. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She put one foot in front of the other, and she kept her eyes on the road ahead. Clay was standing in the doorway when she arrived. He saw her face. He saw the empty basket. He stepped aside to let her in. "What happened?" Grace hung her shawl on the hook by the door. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the fabric. "Nothing that matters." Clay watched her cross to the stove, watched her pour water into the kettle with movements that were too careful, too controlled. "Grace." She stopped. Her back was to him. Her shoulders rose and fell with a single deep breath. "I should leave," he said. "Tomorrow morning. I can ride now. If I'm gone, the talk will stop." Grace turned. Her gray eyes met his across the small cabin. "No, Grace. I said no." Her voice didn't waver. "You don't get to decide what I lose and what I keep. That's my choice, not yours. Not theirs." She turned back to the stove. Clay stood in the doorway, watching her back, watching the rigid line of her shoulders, watching her hands grip the edge of the stove like it was the only thing holding her up. Outside, the sun was setting. The shadows grew long across the floor, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Clay couldn't stay inside the cabin. The walls pressed in. The lamp threw shadows that looked too much like other things, flames licking up wooden beams, smoke rolling across a dirt floor. He pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch, letting the night air hit his face. The sky was clear, stars scattered across the black like salt spilled on a dark table. Orion hung low on the horizon, the hunter chasing prey he would never catch. Clay lowered himself onto the porch step. The wood was rough, full of splinters. His side ached, but the pain had become familiar, almost welcome. It gave him something to focus on. Footsteps behind him, the door creaking open. Grace sat down beside him. She'd wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders. Without asking, she pulled half of it over his arm. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "No." They sat in silence. A coyote called somewhere in the hills. Another answered. The sounds echoed and faded. "You want to talk about it?" Clay's hands hung between his knees. He looked at them scarred, calloused. Dirt ground into the creases of his palms, hands that had failed when it mattered most. "There was a boy," he said. The words came out before he could stop them. "My brother, Tommy, 8 years old." Grace didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. "Our folks had a farm in Kansas, wheat, mostly, some cattle. Pa built a barn the year I turned 15, biggest in the county. He said, Tommy used to play in the hayloft, liked to jump down into the loose straw." Clay's throat tightened. He swallowed against it. "One night, Pa went to town. Ma was sick in bed. I was supposed to watch Tommy, keep him out of trouble." His voice cracked. "But there was a girl, Sarah Jennings, from the next farm over. She came by after dark." The stars blurred above him. He blinked hard. "I left Tommy in the barn, told him to stay put, said I'd be back in an hour." Clay's hands curled into fists. "I was gone 3, chasing a girl who didn't even like me, who laughed at me behind the feed store the next week, told her friends I smelled like cow." His voice broke completely. He bent forward, elbows on his knees, face hidden. "When I came back, the barn was burning. I could hear him screaming. I ran toward the door, but the heat." He stopped, breathed. The roof came down. Silence. The coyotes had gone quiet. Even the wind had stopped. I dug through the ashes with my bare hands, burned them down to the bone. They found me the next morning, kneeling in the mud and char, still digging, crying like a baby, covered in soot and snot, and he couldn't finish. His shoulders shook. No sound came out, just the silent heaving of a body trying to purge something that wouldn't leave. He held up his hands. In the starlight, Grace could see the old scars, white and shiny, stretched tight across his palms and fingers. My mother never spoke to me again. Not one word. She just looked at me like I was already dead, like I should have been the one in that barn. Clay wiped his face with the back of his hand. His nose was running. "My father told me to leave. Said if he ever saw my face again, he'd shoot me like a dog." He felt hollowed out, scraped clean. 12 years he'd carried this, and now it lay between them like something rotting. "I've been running ever since," he said. 12 years. Never stayed anywhere longer than a season. Never let anyone close. Because everyone who gets close to me ends up." He couldn't say it. Grace was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "Dead's dead," she said. "Question is what you do with the living." Clay looked at her. Her face was pale in the starlight. "My uncle sold me," she said. 6 months after my parents died. Told me he was sending me to work for a good family in Denver. Put me on a wagon with 4 other girls. I was 17. Her voice didn't waver. but her hands, wrapped in the blanket, had gone white at the knuckles. I figured out on the third day what kind of work we were going to. I tried to run. They caught me, beat me until I couldn't stand, then put me back on the wagon. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. I got away the second time. Killed a man's horse doing it, rode it until its heart gave out. Walked 40 miles. Begged for scraps behind saloons. Slept in a pig pen because it was the only place no one would look. Her jaw tightened. I've been running 3 years now. Different towns, different names, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, taking whatever work wouldn't ask questions. She looked at her own hands. Sometimes I still smell the pig filth, even when there's nothing there. Clay stared at her, this woman who had stitched his wounds and read him psalms. So don't tell me you're not worth staying for. Her voice was hard now. I know what worthless looks like. I've been it, slept in it. Wore it like a second skin. She met his eyes. You're not it. Clay opened his mouth. A howl cut through the night. Close, too close. Both their heads turned toward the tree line. Clay grabbed Grace's arm and pulled her toward the door. Inside, now! They stumbled into the cabin. Clay threw the iron bolt. His hands found the chair by the window and dragged it across the floor, jamming it under the door handle. Pain ripped through his side. He felt the stitches strain, but didn't stop. The rifle, he said. Where is it? Grace was already moving. She crossed to the corner where the Winchester leaned against the wall, lifted it, checked the chamber the way he'd shown her 2 days ago. Her hands were steady. Another howl, closer, answered by 2 more from different directions. They were being circled. How many shots? Clay asked. 7. He pulled his Colt from his belt. 6 rounds. 13 total. Not enough if the pack decided to rush them. A shadow passed the window. Grace spun toward it, rifle raised, through the dirty glass. Yellow eyes caught the lamplight and held it. The wolf stood motionless, watching. Its breath fogged against the pain. They're testing us, Grace whispered, looking for weak spots. The wolf moved on. Its claws clicked against the porch boards, slow, deliberate, circling. Clay crossed to the stove. The fire had burned low, nothing but embers. He grabbed the iron poker and thrust it into the coals, stirring them to life. Sparks flew up. Fire, he said. They don't like fire. Grace nodded. She pulled pine sticks from the woodpile dry, full of sap, the kind that burned fast and bright. She lit one from the stove and held it like a torch. The flame threw wild shadows across the walls, scratching at the back door, sniffing. A low growl that vibrated through the wood. Grace's torch hand tightened. She didn't move toward the sound, didn't retreat. Clay grabbed a cast iron pot from the shelf above the stove. He banged it against the wall once, twice, 3 times. The sound rang out, sharp and metallic. Make noise, he said, loud as you can. Grace seized the second pot and beat it against the stove. The cabin filled with clanging, banging iron on iron. It hurt Clay's ears. He kept hitting. The scratching at the back door stopped. But now something moved at the front. Paws on wood. The chair under the handle rattled as weight pressed against the door from outside. Grace grabbed a burning stick and hurled it through the window. The glass shattered. The torch landed in the grass outside. Flames spreading in a small circle. The wolves at the window scattered, gray shapes melting back into darkness. Clay grabbed another pine stick, lit it, threw it after the first. Then another. He worked until a semicircle of fire burned around the front of the cabin, flames licking at dry grass. Smoke rising thick and acrid. His side was soaking through his shirt. He could feel blood running down his hip. The stitches had torn. He ignored it. Grace joined him at the broken window. Together, they fed the flames stick after stick, torch after torch. The night outside glowed orange. Smoke drifted across the tree line. A howl rose from the darkness. Confused, frustrated. The pack was retreating, driven back by the fire and the noise and 2 humans who refused to die. Clay's legs buckled. He caught himself on the windowsill, breathing hard. Sit down, Grace said. "You're bleeding again." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Sit down." He sat, not because she told him to, but because his body gave him no choice. He slid down the wall until he was on the floor, back against the rough wood, chest heaving. Grace stayed at the window. The rifle rested against her shoulder, barrel pointed at the darkness beyond the flames. Her face was streaked with soot. Her hair had come loose, wild around her shoulders. She didn't look scared anymore. The howling grew distant, faded, stopped. Silence settled over the cabin. Outside, the fires burned low, casting flickering light across the grass. The first gray hint of dawn touched the horizon. "They're gone," Grace said. Her voice was hoarse. "For now." Clay looked up at her, this woman who had beaten pots and thrown fire and stood her ground without flinching. This woman who had slept in pig pens and walked 40 miles and still had enough fight left to save them both. "You're not alone," he said. The words came out ragged, barely a whisper. Grace turned from the window. The rifle lowered. She looked at him, really looked with those gray eyes that had seen too much and given up on nothing. "I know," she said. She crossed the room and knelt beside him. Her fingers found the edge of his shirt, lifted it, examined the torn stitches beneath. Blood welled from the wound, dark in the dying firelight. "This needs cleaning," she said. "And restitching. Later. Now." And she was already moving water from the canteen, cloth from the shelf, needle and thread from the sewing kit. Her hands worked with the same steady efficiency they always had. No trembling this time. Clay watched her face as she cleaned the wound, the set of her jaw, the furrow between her brows. "Grace." She didn't look up. "Hold still." "Thank you." Her hands paused, just for a moment. Then she pushed the needle through his skin, and he forgot how to breathe. When she finished, she sat back. Her fingers were red with his blood. Again. "You need to rest," she said. "Real rest. A week, at least. Before you can ride." Clay's eyes grew heavy. Exhaustion pulled at him like a current. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Grace's face above his. Her gray eyes holding his, her lips pressed thin with something she wouldn't say. 2 weeks later, Clay's wound had closed enough to ride. He stood in the cabin doorway, watching the sun rise over the cottonwoods. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet grass. The fires they'd set had burned themselves out days ago, leaving black circles in the earth, scars that would take years to fade. His saddlebags sat packed by the door. His horse waited by the fence, already saddled. Grace stood at the stove, her back to him. Coffee, the familiar ritual, grounds into the pot, water from the pump, the hiss of flame catching wood. She didn't ask him to stay. Clay picked up his saddlebags. The leather was cracked, the buckles tarnished. Everything he owned fit inside a change of clothes, a razor, a handful of coins, a photograph so old the faces had faded to ghosts. "Coffee's almost ready," Grace said. She didn't turn around. "I should go." The words hung in the air. Grace's hands stilled on the pot. "You're welcome to it," she said. "Before you leave." Clay set down the bags. He crossed to the table and sat. His side pulled with each movement, but the pain was duller now, manageable. Grace poured 2 cups. She set one in front of him and took the chair across the table. They drank in silence. The coffee was strong, bitter, same as always. When the cups were empty, Clay stood. "Thank you," he said. "For everything." Grace looked up at him. Her gray eyes gave nothing away. "You're welcome." That was all. No tears, no pleading, no declaration that would only make leaving harder. Clay walked to the door. His boots were loud on the wooden floor. Each step felt like pulling against something heavy. He stopped at the threshold. Grace hadn't moved from the table. Her hands were wrapped around the empty cup, knuckles pale. "Take care of yourself," he said. She nodded once. Clay stepped outside. The morning was cool, the sky pale blue with streaks of pink near the horizon. His horse nickered as he approached. He tied the saddlebags behind the saddle, checked the girth, adjusted the stirrups. He was stalling. He knew it. He swung up into the saddle. The leather creaked under his weight. Grace had come to the porch. She stood with her arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe. The shawl was wrapped around her shoulders, the same one she'd worn to town, the same one that had been empty when she came back. Clay touched the brim of his hat. Then he turned the horse toward the road. The cabin grew smaller behind him. He didn't look back. Looking back was weakness. He'd spent 12 years not looking back. The road stretched ahead empty, rutted, winding through brown grass toward the distant mountains, toward the next town, the next job, the next place where nobody knew his name. The boundary marker appeared on his right, a stone pillar, weathered gray, with numbers carved into its face. 1847. Someone had claimed this land decades ago, built something, then left it behind. The way he was leaving now, Clay's horse stopped. He hadn't pulled the reins. The animal just stopped, hooves planted, head turned back toward the cabin. Clay sat in the saddle. His hands rested on the pommel. He looked at the road ahead, at the mountains, at all the empty miles. He thought about the feel of Grace's hand on his when she'd pressed the bandage to his wound, the sound of her voice reading psalms by lamplight, the way she'd stood beside him throwing fire at wolves, refusing to give up. He thought about Tommy, the barn, 12 years of running from a ghost that followed him everywhere. Dead's dead. Question is what you do with the living. Clay turned the horse around. Grace was still on the porch. She hadn't moved. Her arms were still crossed, her face still unreadable. He rode back, dismounted at the fence, walked toward her with his hat in his hands. She watched him come, didn't speak. "I don't have a home," Clay said. His voice came out rough. "No money, no cattle, nothing to offer but a worn-out saddle and a past that won't stay buried." Grace's chin lifted. "That all? That's all." She uncrossed her arms, stepped down from the porch, stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her gray eyes. "I don't have a home either," she said. "Nothing but a borrowed cabin and a past I've been running from for 3 years." She held out her hand, palm up, waiting. "Maybe we could build one," she said. "Together." Clay looked at her hand, work-worn, scarred from the torches, the nails broken short. He took it. Her fingers closed around his, warm, strong, behind them. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney. The horse nickered softly. A meadowlark sang in the grass. Clay West had spent 12 years believing he deserved nothing. Standing here, holding this woman's hand in the autumn light, he wondered if maybe he'd been wrong. There is something quiet that settles after a story like this. Something tender, maybe something familiar that sits in the chest and doesn't ask to be named. Many of us have stood at a crossroads like Clay did not, knowing whether to keep walking or turn back. Some of us have been Grace, waiting on a porch, refusing to beg but hoping anyway. We carry these moments with us, the almost leavings and the staying despites, the loves we nearly lost, and the ones we found in unlikely places. Perhaps you have known what it feels like to be seen by someone when you believed you were invisible. Perhaps you have held someone's hand and felt the weight of 2 broken lives, choosing to lean into each other instead of apart. These things don't need to be resolved. They are allowed to rest, just as they are unfinished, imperfect, human. Not every wound closes cleanly. Not every story ends with answers. And that is all right. Thank you for staying until the end. It has been a gift to share this quiet hour with you.